All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Xander Ballwit. I'm the editor and chief of Asimov Press. And today I'm speaking with Thomas Moynihan, an intellectual historian and the author of Asimov Press's latest piece, Life as Slime. I'll be digging deeper into some of the themes and asking Tom some more questions that arose for me while I was reading it. But before we dig into the piece itself, I would love for Tom to introduce himself.
Hey, yeah, thanks for having me. My name's Thomas Moynihan, and I am a historian of ideas, which I take to be the study of how worldviews transform over time as our species learns more about the wider universe and our position within it. My previous book was called X Risk: How Humanity Discovered Its Own Extinction, published with MIT in 2020. So a book about kind of global calamities published during the pandemic. Um, that book kind of argued for the distinctness of the idea of human extinction against elder traditional religious notions of apocalypse, and traced how that emerged from various fields of science, from probability to paleontology. Aside from writing for various academic outlets, I've written for the BBC, The Guardian, Aeon, and now also Asimov Press. So yeah, it's great to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. I can see how you arrived to this piece from the interest that you mentioned in your books. So your piece is about how prominent scientists continue to claim that life is just slime on a spinning rock, but how now in an age when the rarity and fragility of biological life is increasingly evident, you urge that it's time for us to start thinking differently. More than that, though, it's a piece of intellectual history about our thinking of the origins of life on Earth, its abundance, and how it relates to how we view ourself and our stature as living things. Um, I'd like to begin by asking, so religion comes up quite a lot in this piece, and it feels central to grasping kind of the tension of viewing human life as slime. So you begin the piece by introducing Ferdinand von Röntgen, who's a German physician, and he's imagining how the first humans birthed themselves against kind of the prevailing Christian views of the time. And you write, quote, that theologians decried that by implying we weren't descended from Adam, Röntgen demoted us to fungus people with a pedigree that is but a nativity of slime. Can you elaborate a little bit on why theologians would have been so upset by this view and how this kind of kicks off this whole conversation about whether or not humans are a special kind of life?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question, and opening a summary of the piece. Um, it was during the research that led up to me, formulating the idea to this piece. The kind of discovery that led to the inspiration to write it was a slow dawning realization over the years that this picture that I think most of us kind of inherit from like our kind of school education, of like the position of Darwin in kind of the history of ideas, is that before Darwin, the kind of general view was something like supernatural or miraculous creation. That is, that species were made by God by a supernatural intervention within the world, and everyone held to this kind of very Christian theological view within Europe. And then Darwin comes along and like knocks that all away, and through the help of his friends like Thomas Henry Huxley, begins convincing the world that no, life descended from the simplest forms, and we descended, more proximally from apes, um, from primates. Uh, the picture is, as with all things in history, is far more complicated. So amongst scientists, prior to Darwin, there were many other views as to how not just life itself got made, but by how species were made. Everyone knows a bit about Lamarck and his idea of transmutation or transformism. Um, but particularly in the German context, there was another idea that was very prevalent, and that was that species, complicated lineages of advanced life, can spontaneously emerge from unorganized matter. And so, this is where the slime comes in. And this was an entirely naturalistic theory. So these scientists who are promoting this, like Röntgen, who you mentioned, who believed that the first humans kind of emerged like fungal growths from Uferschlamm, which is like riverside mud in German. And the kind of nice details about this is that he was an obstetrician, so he kind of knew how difficult childbirth was, and so was like, well, they must have been protected by something. So he reasoned that nature had provided these kind of incubator substitutes to a human womb for these first germinal embryos. And so he really reasoned that, of course, this must have resembled Rafflesia arnoldi, better known as the stinking corpse lily, this massive, fleshy, corpulent flower. And he thought these kind of incubated these first embryos. Anyway, it was, as I say, entirely naturalistic. He was not thinking that there was any intervention of God or anything supernatural going on here, um, which is, again, really fascinating. It seems so obvious to us now, post Darwin, that complicated life forms can't just spontaneously spring from unorganized matter. But back then, this was a viable and live theory, and as I say, very popular, particularly in the European context, particularly in the German context. And so this, to kind of loop back to this question of religion, is yes, religion looms very large in the piece, because this idea that life is just slime, which the piece explores, you can trace back to this kind of early 1800s context. But we all are familiar with like famous scientists saying it. Stephen Hawking is the kind of really obvious, really well recognized one of saying that life is just slime on a kind of rock spinning around a modest or moderate star, whatever his wording is. Um, this idea that life is just slime can be traced back to this pre-Darwinian period where the theories of the day, religious or non-religious, were that just like complicated things could just spring out of anywhere, which makes life look a little bit like a disease in the sense that it's kind of it's that overabundance of life is a putrescence, is how I put it in the piece. And so that idea, it kind of arrives from a completely outdated and outmoded scientific context. And here's the point where religion comes into play: is what does the just in life is just slime is why just? What else were you expecting? Why is it shocking to find out that life is a form of protoplasm that has complicated itself over 4 billion years? I argue.
It seems like it just kind of knocks down our importance a little bit. Like if you're listening to these kind of more religious perspectives that say you are
Mhm.
somehow special or descended from Adam, to say you are, you're just life that cropped up, no different from any other life, or even that you're a kind of mold.
Yeah.
You can see how that would be a bit deflating. I'm curious too because I think in the piece you refer to another one of the objectors saying that this worldview from Ritgen was one of the noxious fruits of scientific nihilism, which I really like because I feel like if anything, science is kind of the opposite of nihilism. It's looking for meaning and organization. And so,
Mm.
can you explain what that means? I guess maybe that comes back to this idea of religiosity and the importance of having a little bit more meaning, I suppose, than just any other kind of life.
Yeah. So particularly Abrahamic religions put humanity in this kind of protagonist role in the wider universe. That's a big claim, and there are actually good arguments that we're not, because we're fallen, and particularly in like kind of medieval Christian cosmology, Earth is basically only one step removed from like the most abominable place in the universe, which is hell. And so we're kind of living just one level above the basement. Um, but nonetheless, there is like a kind of protagonist role. Like humanity is central to the wider workings of the universe. Our story is also the story of creation in some sense. Um, and so it's only if you've been steeped in such notions, such assumptions, and they've shaped your expectations, perhaps even in like very subtle subconscious ways, that you can feel that there is any demotion when it turns out that no, again, we are just complicated protoplasm. So that's what the just, I argue, comes from. It comes from an elder epoch, wherein humans were taught that they had this kind of more central, more dignified, more protagonistic role. So yeah, as is explored in the piece, even overt, avowed atheists still engage in this just claim. Part of that might just be because it becomes a trope and a motif, and it becomes recognizable, and people repeat memes. But I also do think that, yeah, another part of that is that um, you know conceptual attitudes are and habits, once stuck in place, are very hard to overcome. And even if you are overtly claiming that you're an atheist, or that you recognize that we live in a godless world, or you believe that we do, I guess I should say, um, you still inherit those expectations. And so the fact that like some of your kind of most like vociferous atheists, or um, that might not be the best word, but something like that, like Nietzsche or Schopenhauer, these like very godless philosophers, they were the most favorite, the most kind of, well, how shall I say? They produced some of the most evocative versions of this, like life is just a mold. Like Nietzsche said that if the earth can be said to have a skin, then humanity is but a skin disease. Like they relish in this rhetoric. And I think it's because they were living in an era where it was the twilight of these elder expectations. It's very hard for us now to really think about how hard emotionally it must have been, even if like, at the most kind of, kind of cogitative, rational part of your mind is like committing to the belief that we do live in a godless and atheistic universe. These people had still grown up in a culture that had been completely steeped in the opposite view. And so I think that that's where this comes from. You could call it conceptual inertia. It's like the expectations of the past, even once they are kind of overcome in theory, still affect and have a drag on us emotionally. And so I think that's an explanation for why this motif persists even to today. Is we all grew up in cultures that in the past did have more of a more of a sense that there is this kind of external guarantee of our meaning within the wider universe. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I love this idea of conceptual inertia because I think the holdover of these beliefs did really strike me, especially from people like Nietzsche, as you say.
Mm,
There was a quote in the piece from Thus Sprach Zarathustra where he writes, the human intellect in nature has no further mission than what would lead beyond human life.
mm,
And again, you can kind of sense that deflation. And
mm.
I guess, I mean, here we are, many, many years later, and this is still playing out. So do you think that many scientists today, or that, like, how much more do you think we have shaken this view, or do you still see kind of remnants of this today?
Yeah, I still see remnants of it because I think that um, intellectual history is very similar to evolutionary history in some ways, and completely like wildly different in others. But one of them is that it's conservative in the same way that evolution is. It has to make do with what happens to have been inherited, and it can't, build de novo. And so all of our worldviews are made from the refuse of elder ones. And yeah, I think you do see that. Often people get very worried about that, and they think that it debunks our ideas or kind of creates a problem of legitimacy. The fact that modern scientific rational secular ideas can have this kind of baggage from elder theological ones. um, the argument is often levied to kind of delegitimize the more modern ideas and say, for example, there's a kind of argument that's been going around in philosophy and history circles since basically the end of World War II, is that the idea of progress is just a secularized version of Abrahamic eschatology, the idea that time has an inherent direction, that we're leading towards some kind of culmination. Yeah, people use that to kind of debunk or delegitimize. I'm perfectly fine with it. I don't think it delegitimizes our modern ideas that they have their roots in elder kind of outlooks, precisely in the same way that the fact that, and again, as is mentioned in the piece, the fact that we came from the lowliest, quote unquote, lowliest life forms, that doesn't make me feel, upset about our ancestry at all. I think it just shows how far life has come, which is also therefore a hopeful indication of how much further it might yet go. So I see it in this way as well. Like I'm just not stressed out by the fact that there is clearly residue of theology in our outlooks. Yeah. So, like this idea of there being a cosmic mission or some external purpose given granted to us, people still inhabit that frame in many different ways. And if it has some resonance and resemblance to these elder theological ideas, so be it. If it gives people purpose, then fine.
Yeah, I think I'm with you on that. If it, whatever makes us oriented towards, impact or mission, even if it is a holdover from religious beliefs that I might not subscribe to, I'm happy they're there.
Yeah.
Yeah, so moving on to the next question. So in selecting for someone to read this piece and kind of give feedback and fact check, I was looking for someone with a really fascinating kind of medley of expertise. And I was lucky enough to find Jamie Fayol Busca, who works at Homeworld Collective, and she studies astrobiology and geomicrobiology. So they're two fields that essentially involve looking at rock and studying the necessary conditions for life to emerge from inorganic material. So both of these fields didn't exist until recently. And more amazingly, I was surprised to learn from your piece that there was a great deal of debate about the boundary between living and non living things. And I would love for you to explain this a little bit more and maybe emphasize what it suggests that we didn't even really have this concept inorganic until after the 19th century.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, again, Jamie was a brilliant fact checker. Just, some more than a fact checker, just some really brilliant feedback and suggestions for like expanding parts of the piece, which was really great to have slightly later in the day. But yeah, to your question, so and again, this was something that really shocked me when I first kind of realized it through my reading and research, several years ago now, um, is that there kind of wasn't much debate. So there was debate, as you say, in terms of whether life must always arise from other life, or whether it can emerge spontaneously from unliving matter, and also around like there's a whole vibrant, rich debate throughout from kind of the early modern period onwards about how like new life is gestated in the womb. So one of the major theories was preformationism, which held that um, well, basically, a miniature version of every single future generation is encapsulated within, like, Adam's sperm, basically, and they just kind of unpack like Russian dolls.
Yeah, I
Um,
love all the illustrations of the tiny guys in their
yeah,
little
yeah,
cases.
yeah, the tiny homunculi. So there was, a really, really vibrant debate around that. The opposing position was called epigenesis, which held that like organic matter could kind of spontaneously come together and form itself rather than having to have, the tiny guy. So there was massive debate there. But yes, as you point out, this idea or just acknowledgement, awareness to the fact that when it comes to looking at the cosmic level, um, like almost all matter is inorganic. The organic, or I should formulate that differently. The organic is a, a like very a very small when looked at in terms of time and space subpartition of matter. So yeah, the recognition that most of the universe, almost all of it, appears to be made from hydrogen and helium, inorganic elements. That's gated upon the development of spectroscopy, which is a middle to late 19th century development. Um, just this recognition that you know the cosmos at large appears to be almost entirely inorganic is requires a really zoomed out cosmic view, and obviously that's not what people have had for most of history, and so if you think about things empirically, and I mean empirically in the most kind of minimalistic sense, when we look around the world that we inhabit, kind of ambling around the surface of planet Earth, it does appear that life just kind of springs everywhere that it can. As I say in the piece, I think, if you leave food out, it begins to rot. If you leave a wound untreated, it begins to fester. Mold, mildew, appears. It's a problem. I have it in my house. It's like it just appears. So without a vast amount of ancillary knowledge about our position within the wider universe, just relying purely empirically on that observation, I think it makes sense that people thought that life could emerge out of unorganized matter, particularly complicated forms of life. And again, many people thought this for a very long time. You find reference to it in Shakespeare, in Antony and Cleopatra, to the belief that like alligators and crocodiles could just spontaneously emerge from the Nile, from the mud on the edge of the Nile. And so, yeah, and to kind of really hammer this home, the word inorganic, in the kind of inorganic chemistry sense, only really begins to emerge after 1800. And I find this really fascinating. Prior to this, the word inorganical, so inorganic with an A and an L coming afterwards, was in use prior to that, but it primarily referred to discarnate forms of life. So spirits, ghouls, ghosts, souls. And I just find that really telling that before this point in time where people, through advances in chemistry, cosmology, geology, began to recognize that, the organic is this special sub-partition of, kind of the matter available to us in the wider cosmos. Prior to this point, like life wasn't counterposed or contrasted against this, wider environing kind of inorganic form of matter that doesn't require any relationship to organic life. But instead, life was counterposed to, like incorporeal forms of life. So there wasn't even a recognition that, yes, the inorganic is this very important partition of matter. And yeah, it was new to people to really deal with that. And there was, again, talking about inertia, there was resistance to it for the longest time. I would say in terms of wider culture, it really only begins to sink in the late 19th century and leads to things like Freud's idea of the death drive. If you actually kind of look at Beyond the Pleasure Principle, the book wherein he formulates his famous and, to my eyes, completely insane idea of the death drive, it's upon this reflection. He's like, most of the universe is inorganic, not just in space but in time. And so if that's the default state of matter, then matter must want to, in some sense, return to this kind of original resting state. The organic is just this weird blip that, in the wider picture must resolve itself into what it first was. Which, yeah, again, is very...
I think that made its way into your piece in the form of the lecture from Genes, where he's talking about how it might just be like the late stage consequence of life on Earth, and that we're occupying a very small sliver of time in which this isn't really, this is just a very small portion of what it is to be on this planet at any given time, as you say.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. And
No.
then something you were talking about earlier that kind of drove at this already is that these notions weren't totally outlandish. You look around and you do see fruit rotting and you see maggots pullulating. And one of my favorite things about intellectual history, when done well, of course, is that it makes these things seem less unreasonable, right? These older views, they just didn't have the tools, as you say, to kind of get where we are today. There was one from your piece I really enjoyed as well, which was from Erasmus Darwin, where he viewed the organic world as shaping the inorganic one rather than the other way around. And he observed, the shells and the limestone and all of this. And that's even how we ended up with their coat of arms, which is everything from shells. So I guess I'm curious, yeah, I mean, you've already spoken to it a little bit, but how do we think about these kind of outmoded ideas getting us to where we are and how they are rooted in a kind of empiricism, just albeit lacking in some tools?
Yeah. So, again, that's a fantastic question. And on the Darwin point, so the grandfather of Charles, Erasmus, he was a very noted and influential naturalist in his day. So kind of the turn of the 1700s into the 1800s, and yeah, he was reflecting on the kind of fairly recently acknowledged discovery and understanding that chalk and limestone, which obviously kind of where Darwin well, both of the famous Darwins resided in, southeast England, makes up a very large part of the landscape. There's the famous White Cliffs of Dover. There's chalk everywhere. Where these people would have been, going for their walks upon which they speculated on their theories. The recent recognition that chalk limestone is a biogenic mineral. So it's, as we all know, it's formed from just an unimaginable amount of tiny shell creatures, foraminifera, I think they're called, crushed into this mineral that we recognize and often walk along. And so Darwin was reflecting on that, and also the recent recognition that coral reefs could form islands. So this idea that life can form land masses. And so he again, from this quite simple empirical observation or acknowledgement that this process can happen and does happen, he extrapolated. And this is often what scientists do, and it's how theories are generated. You take a simple observation or insight, and you extrapolate. Talking about inertia, in a sense, that's how Galileo arrived at that idea. So Darwin extrapolated from there to kind of basically arrive at this idea that life germinates the inorganic body of planets rather than the other way around. So he thought that basically the Earth started as just one giant ocean. And he kind of acknowledges that there might have had to have been some nucleus of inorganic rock at the very center, but tiny. And he then also believed that this giant ocean would have been filled with tiny microorganisms, and through their kind of digestive processes and their growing of shells and the shedding of shells, over unimaginable eons would have built up the inorganic body of the world. So, not just the continents and land masses, but pretty much the entire mantle. Which again is just it's to us now that's crazy. Obviously, planets precede life rather than the other way around. We all kind of are so familiar with that idea now. But yeah, again, back then, to your point and to your question, Darwin was kind of just doing a pretty simple maneuver that scientists do when they're forming theories. And so to kind of wrap that up in a nice nice little bow is that Erasmus Darwin was then moved to change the family coat of arms to E conscious omnia, everything from shells, because of his belief that the entire planet was germinated from tiny foraminifera. Other people have taken this idea, have taken that decision of Erasmus Darwin's and read into it he had a proto theory of evolution, nothing like Charles Darwin's, because it didn't involve natural selection. Well, let's not get into the technicals of that. But yeah, it certainly wasn't the theory of evolution by natural selection as we recognize it. But he did believe, as Lamarck did around the same time, that more complicated forms of life kind of transformed from simpler ones. And so there are points in his work where he refers to how we're all descended from the kind of mollusks. And so some people say that that's where the family coat of arms thing comes from, which I think is legitimate. But I also think this is another option, is that he literally thought the entire planet came from shells as well, not just life. So but as you say, it's a good example of how kind of doing a maneuver that's completely legitimate in scientific theory generation, ended up in this idea that is just obviously a massive dead end. But it's kind of poetic and beautiful as well. So yeah.
Right. I was going to ask, what would the updated version of that coat of arms be today? But I think we're still figuring it out, right? I was everything from, we're working on it.
Yeah, I guess Big Bang nuclear synthesis would be the common ancestor of everything. Yeah.
Well, it might sound prettier in Latin.
That's true.
The next question I had was, a big takeaway from the piece is that we should maybe not be so dismissive of life because of its rarity and maybe the fact that life only exists on Earth. In fact, we've been looking for life in the universe since the 1960s, and there has been of yet no concrete proof. There's been people that have said that there's been some evidence of carbon-bearing molecules in various exoplanets. Just recently there's a big report saying that is overblown. So I guess I'm curious how finding concrete evidence of life on other planets, were we to do so, how would that change the message in this piece, or kind of be put in conversation with things that you were arguing here?
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Well, I mean, it's at this point entirely banal to point out that that would be the most profound discovery, or it would at least be a candidate for the most profound discovery yet to arrive from human inquiry. Because yeah, it would completely change our sense of ourselves and our position in the universe. Yeah, and I guess it part of it is troubling as well. So obviously uh, we look at life on Earth, and it's the kind of consensus view being that it emerged from one single common origin. Given that for one example, we all have the same chirality, as one of the previous pieces that Asimov Press explored, the mirror life piece. But yeah, the evidence seems to point that there's one common origin to life on Earth, and we all descend from that. But if you look at what life did on Earth, it spread to almost every conceivable niche from that one, fruitful beginning, and has completely transformed the entire planet in terms of its, geochemistry. It's reorganized the entire planet in a really dramatic way, and a way that would be quite obvious if you're looking from without and you had some sense of chemistry and what to look for. And so it's interesting that we don't see abundant evidence of that happening elsewhere. What's to say that that must stop at the planetary level? If life takes hold elsewhere, why has it? Why not it take hold and transform and reorganize energy and matter at scales much larger than that? And so it's telling that we don't see any sign of that, of course. And again, as you say, we've been looking since the 1960s, and SETI in its beginning was rather crude. It was looking for intelligent radio messages. Now, obviously, it's far more sophisticated, and there's all different forms. But there's obviously now a very rich and rapidly developing science of biosignatures and what the kind of things we should be looking for are. But even though we've been looking for a long time and looking quite hard, and I think we should be looking a little bit harder. There should be more, kind of more SETI endeavors. There's just we haven't readily found evidence for anything, and so I do think that's telling. We know that life spreads, and yet we haven't seen any life elsewhere spreading, and so I think that it kind of depends on how complicated the life is that we find. If we find very simple life, obviously that updates our kind of sense of how likely independent origins of life are throughout the wider cosmos, and we could then still sleep sound at night by saying, well, it's very simple forms of life might be cosmically abundant and common, but something on the route from simple protoplasm to protoplasm that can fling rocket ships beyond its parent star might be improbable. We could still rest easy at night with that if we found simple. But if we found more complicated forms of life, I think that muddies that picture a bit, and tips us on the other side to maybe thinking, well, maybe we don't see life reorganizing matter and energy at kind of scales beyond planetary, or even like more dramatic scales, because there's something transient about the type of life that can fling rocket ships, because rocket ships also deliver nuclear payloads, which is but that argument's been that basic form of argument has been pretty prevalent since SETI began in the 60s, again in a Cold War context. But that idea of kind of our precarity and bellicoseness as a species has become salient again in the past years for obvious reasons, given that there is conflict again in Europe, etc. So yeah, but that's just to muddy the picture. Even though it would be the most profound and amazing and curiosity provoking event potentially in human history, there are also darker currents to to consider as well. But yeah, I would love for it to happen regardless. But yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, and I know that I like what you said about the simplicity picture, like going from looking for, highly complex beings to being like, actually, we might just be looking for, carbon-bearing molecules and smaller signatures. And it does seem like now we have a better sense of the, as you call them in the piece, stringent preconditions necessary for life. In fact, we kind of know more about this, going back to geochemistry and some of these other fields that where people are increasingly trying to tinker with how to create life from scratch or modify it, mostly in the lab with, varying degrees of success. But I am kind of curious how these efforts change the picture at all. Like perhaps there's one view where life actually isn't nearly abundant enough, and we're trying to create more of it in various ways or improve upon it in these various ways that we now have access to as we increasingly understand the kind of basis for life. So how does that play in here, all of these efforts to then kind of, I mean, maybe it's the birth of synthetic biology, but something like this, how does it change the picture?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, I often think, just to kind of, zoom out, but also go back to the very basics, is, you know, imagine two possible futures from, branching from tomorrow. One, the first one is where, say, there's some, gigantic supernova kind of detonates close enough to Earth to, wipe out all life tomorrow. Um, Future number two, life continues developing on Earth. Humans continue innovating, inventing, maybe through synthetic biology, kind of creates the ability somehow to seed life beyond Earth. Life spreads beyond its parent sun, regardless of if humanity's involved in that, just life, Um, and yeah, kind of life flourishes in the wider cosmos for many, 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 many um, aeons more than it currently already has. Weigh up those two universes, which is better? I mean, I just definitely think the second one is, just instinctually. I'm not an ethicist, but that just seems like a brighter, more vibrant universe to me. And so, does that then lead to the position that a universe with more biodiversity in it is just inherently better? Part of me wants to just accept that and say, well, then yes, of course, we should increase that diversity and fill the cosmos with as much life as is possible. And many people hold to that view, historically and contemporarily. Of course, again, it does become complicated because maximizing all possible forms of life would it probably involve maximizing parasites, given that 40% of life is parasitic in some sense. So it
I
becomes
think
a
about this a lot because I feel like I do hear people espouse frequently, the innate value of biodiversity. There's something inherently special about it. But I don't hear as often the leap from that into this kind of urgency around speciation. And therefore we should be creating as much of it as possible. It's usually more a conversation about protecting it. So yeah, I'm kind of curious what you think about this. Is there some bigger, and maybe that's reason, like what you said, is there's this kind of dual pronged thing is when we talk about speciation, what are we trying to bring into existence? Is it yet more nematodes and parasites, or we seem to care more about charismatic megafauna? So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Well, I mean, personally, I'm a fan of the mosquito as much as I am of the mammoth. They're both majestic in their own way, right? And yeah, I recently being in a tropical country was assaulted by many mosquitoes, so I have reason not to like them, but yet I do. No, but to seriously answer your question, yeah, well, I don't know. Again, I'm not an ethicist, so it's not my job to make conclusions about this. But well, this actually does loop back to something in the piece, is that historically, people have tended to bite the bullet on the view that the universe contains as much abundant diversity as it can. So, this is something I've written about in previous work. It's called the principle of plenitude. It's this idea that everything possible must actually exist. And this was a view that is just entirely prevalent, particularly throughout the Western tradition, but was seen as just a really good thing. That we live in a universe that was created by a perfect God, and a perfect God would fill that universe with as much life as possibly there could be. Um, and so, people used to think that this was a descriptive fact about the wider universe, that it contained all possible species, and that was a good thing because the perfect creator wouldn't leave like a gap in his canvas. That was kind of the thinking that went into it. Whereas now that's kind of shifted in a like more kind of secular, less theistic age, to it potentially being like a prescriptive goal or like a desideratum to like go and fill the universe. But yeah, as you say, again, like yeah, does that mean that all possible nematodes have to exist? But this did make people tie people into conceptual knots because, again, as we discussed in the piece, one of these scientists who was keen on this idea that life spontaneously emerged from unorganized matter was very upset and confused about tapeworms because he recognized that tapeworms cannot survive outside of their host, but it hadn't yet been recognized that they reproduce via kind of microscopic eggs that can survive outside of a host. So he thought that upon kind of Genesis and the birth of creation, Adam would have had to have been filled with all possible tapeworms, all possible species of tapeworms, because God wouldn't like suffer any of his creations, like even the most lowly and humble and even disgusting, to like go temporarily homeless. So this was what led him to kind of believing this very kind of almost revolting idea about Adam being kind of overwhelmed by parasites.
Interesting. Yeah, I think in the piece you have the quote about, was he not overrun by vermin? But I guess by that logic, he would be overrun by kind of every form of microbial pathogen. I feel even worse for the guy.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
And I'm curious earlier when you talk about this, how we've kind of moved to this idea of, moved from this idea that maybe God had created every possible thing that could exist to now there's possibly holes or rooms for evolution or tinkering or improving or what have you. Where did that change occur? Like I think in the piece you mentioned that Darwin had also said that there is far more possible than extant. So did it begin with him or a little bit further back?
So I think that so Darwin never actually said that directly, and I think that his sense of the kind of superfluity of the organically possible over what is actual wasn't as big as we might actually assume. But it's a massive implication of his theory that that there is more organically possible than can ever be actual. And this was like his major departure from prior thought, and what allowed him to formulate the theory of evolution in the first place, as he formulated it, is that to break with this old view that all possible species either concurrently or sequentially must exist. He broke with that, and that's what allowed him to explain why life is the way it is today, which is the explanatory power of his theory. Life is the way it is today rather than any other way because prior organisms propagated to the permanent exclusion of other possibilities. That's really profound because it involves this idea of unrealized possibility being really key to the history of life itself. But nonetheless, Darwin was, and again, because he was a product of his time, like everyone is, he was, I think, pretty convinced that evolution in the main leads to what he called perfection, and it seems that he thought of perfection as something bipedal, big-brained, basically human. There's a letter I found of his that he wrote to I forget exactly who, but he wrote it a couple of years after publishing Origin. And he says, basically, he does a thought experiment. What would happen if all mammals were wiped out tomorrow? And he admits that he truly believes that the reptiles would basically then repeat the kind of path towards humanoid intelligence. and then imagines like future reptiles that are like even more cerebrally equipped than humans. So he had this definitely had an understanding that not everything possible can happen, and that's what lends evolution its like historical nature. But I think had a kind of slightly truncated view of just how wide that possibility space is. I think the sense of how wide it is gradually grows as people realize from Darwin up to the present day the central role of contingency in the history of life. A big episode here is the recognition that dates to the 80s and 90s that the dinosaurs died from a kind of chancy collision rather than from being kind of maladapted and doomed to extinction in some sense. That idea only gets overcome there, and that like really kind of hammers home the role of contingency in macro history. That if that massive rock hadn't slammed into Earth 66 million years ago, like we wouldn't be here. And so that expands the possibility space much more. But the first time that I found people really saying there is far more organically possible than is actual and explicitly was in the early 1900s. And unfortunately, I discovered this after writing the piece, so it didn't make it in. But in the context of the first biologists who started talking about a synthetic biology, so this is in the very opening years of the 1900s. There's a German American biologist, Jacques Loeb, who explicitly says there are far more species possible than can be actual, and it is now the goal of modern biology to try and bring some of those artificial like those unrealized species artificially into existence. And then following his lead, another biologist, Stefan Leduc, in I think 1909, starts talking about how modern biology has now shifted into a new phase, and he was writing in French, so it's synthetique biology. But it's the first time that synthetic biology was used in print, and it was kind of in this context of being like, we can create artificial species if there are more possible than actual in the organic world. And so there is actually, this was to my surprise that even just the words on page synthetic biology go back pretty far. But I think since Darwin, our sense of just the sheer extent of biological possibility has just like ballooned.
Wow. Yeah, that seems very prescient, and also makes me think about how it's kind of a rejection of this idea of all life forms being to the permanent exclusion of others as well. I feel like synthetic biologists have taken it upon themselves to try to show that we can recreate what was lost, or else bring other things into existence from maybe some point that is further back. You mentioned that surprised you, and I'm curious if there's anything else in doing research for this piece that surprised you or delighted you or didn't make its way into the piece because of length.
That's a fabulous question, and again, it's something that I discovered since, and again, it would have been nice to make it into the piece, but as you point out, it was already kind of on the larger end. So maybe it's good that I've discovered some more interesting stuff since. But it was again a German scientist in 1896 who wrote a book that is very rare to find in print, but luckily someone digitized it. And the title of the book translates into English as "The Sun is Inhabited," and so he basically claims by this time, by the late 1800s, there was a very universal assent that the sun is a giant, incredibly hot body. But he thought that it was not, and he thought that there's some kind of aurora borealis that gives it that sense, but underneath it's like an actual hard shell. And he claimed that the surface of it is inhabited with animals, and that he disagreed with Darwin. Again, this is like 1896, so this shows how, again, conceptual inertia. He clung to the idea that life generates spontaneity from slime. So he talks about there being marshes at the poles of the sun, and from the slime of these marshes, not just animals in general, but like the same species as Earth like generate. So he believed that the sun is inhabited with dinosaurs and humans, which is just wild. Again, he was an amateur scientist. No one paid any attention to this, but I still think it's interesting to find historical quirks like this, where someone is still, even in 1896, not far from the rediscovery of Mendel and like the whole kind of beginning of the modern synthesis, still holding to like views similar to the obstetrician Ritgen that we first mentioned, thinking that not just other planets are like occupied by the same species, because basically there's no history required, there's no unrepeatable improbable series of events that leads to a species particular like ourselves. No, because there's no history required at all, the same species exist not just on every planet but also on the sun. I just found that when I came across that recently, I just found that just charming and quixotic. And the fact that he also was like still clinging very, very ardently to this idea that life emerges from slime is
And that they all exist at one time as well. So there were humans traipsing around alongside the dinosaurs all at
yeah.
once.
Yeah, and he doesn't really supply a reason for that, but it makes the theory even more interesting. But yeah.
Well, that seems
Yeah,
like it would lend itself very well to some fiction. So if
yeah.
anyone out there listening wants to wants to broach it, I'd be welcome to it. Amazing. So maybe to end, I'm always thrilled to see intellectual historians comment on the intersection between history and contemporary science fields like synthetic biology. And I would love to hear your argument for the value of research, such as what you did for this piece, and how it kind of shapes how we think about science and scientific progress today.
Yeah. Well, I think the question of progress is a vexed one, and it's only become more vexed. But it's easy to be a cynic when you don't take stock, and taking stock requires looking to the past, and it's only by looking to the past. And a kind of phrase that I use in the piece is showing how just like a single gem of insight has to be hewn from a mountain of error. You miss that. You don't see that unless you look backwards. Unless you saw that only 100 years ago people were still kind of thinking it was sensible to claim, scientifically that there are humans and dinosaurs concurrently on the sun and they emerge from slime. Again, he was an amateur, but like serious scientists were, not long before that, claiming that complicated animals like humans emerge from sea sludge, and that type of event happens all the time. Stuff that's like so obviously erroneous to us now. Like you need to look past. You need to look into the past to catch sight of the fact that the history of ideas is a history of errors. To know just how far we've come. And again, as I hinted at a bit earlier as well, it's only in looking at how far we've come, again, not even in a massive time frame. It's like you don't have to go thousands of years back to find like wildly erroneous ideas about biology, chemistry, cosmology. It's only by seeing how far we've come that you get any sense of the scope of how far we might yet go. And so the world is like filled with errors and like massive ignorance, but we've conquered so much of that in the past that like looking to these errors and these ignorances of the past and how vast they were, actually, in a weird way, paradoxically fills me with hope for the future and what we might yet overcome. And so, my job is, I have the good fortune to have the job of documenting those overcomings. But it's like scientists and engineers working today who are pushing forward the shock front of that overcoming. And I'm just thankful that they're doing it, and I hope that there are future historians of science that will document them. So
I hope so too. Now, you said that scientific progress is a little bit vexed. I'm curious if you have a working definition of scientific progress. How do you think about it?
Oh wow, that's a good question. I would say again that it's to do with this. It's to do. There are many different definitions I could go for, but I'll go for this one. It's like a zooming out from our like parochial, myopic perspective to increasingly, like perspectives increasingly untethered from the human here and now. I think that is one definition of scientific progress, seen in a very conceptual way. But from those developments come like genuine world changing technological innovations. But like we take for granted now, again, that knowledge that I was referring to earlier, that we now know the elements that make up the rest of the entire universe. And, that came from technological innovations. From, one amongst them was Bunsen, who, we inherit the Bunsen burner from. But yeah, it's I think it's an increasing zooming outwards, and a better picture of where we are in that widest possible picture. Because I think that ultimately humans are like orienting animals. Like, we seek to know the world to navigate through it better. And other animals do that. I was just reading about how clever crows are, and they certainly do that to a degree as well. But we do it in a way that has like conceptual theoretical models that can elaborate the universe and its workings and its laws and regularities at the biggest possible scale, which is really impressive. And so I guess a nice place to close might be on how this was David Deutsch's rejoinder to Stephen Hawking's claim that we are just lowly sludge spinning around a moderate star. Was that he kind of basically said that yes, we are sludge, but we are sludge that can like figure out the laws of the universe writ large. And so I think that is scientific progress to me, is just us better figuring out where we came from, what we are, and where we might be going, in the most zoomed out possible sense.
I really like that. I like that we're after orientation, predictive power, maybe greater senses of control. But I think I agree that there's probably definitions of scientific progress that fit our needs for differing contexts. But the zooming out seems maybe central to all of them and contextualizing. So all
Yeah.
right. I want to thank everyone so much for listening, and thank you so much, Tom, for writing for us. His piece "Life as Slime" is up on Asimov Press today. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and it was just an absolute joy to write for Asimov Press, and it's an honor to be involved. So thank you so much.
Thank you.